You're in the water loop.
Waterloop.
Hey, this is Travis with Waterloop. I want to tell you a story about High Sierra Showerheads, who I'm proud to have as a sponsor of this podcast, particularly because they make incredibly water-efficient showerheads. I've talked with owner David Malcolm about growing up in California, learning about the importance of water and energy efficiency from his father. David has been designing high-efficiency nozzles for agriculture and golf courses for the past 30 years. The golf course people actually came to him wanting a nozzle that produced a uniform spray but was water efficient. So David went in and designed a nozzle that explodes a low pressure stream of water into a shower of large, powerful droplets. David actually thought this would make a great showerhead, and that's how High Sierra Showerheads was born. And nobody has their nozzle technology. It's patented, and you get a great shower while saving water. Use promo code WATERLOOP for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
Waterloop.
Welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Going to be talking about financial risk today. Very happy to be joined by Greg Characklis. He is director of the Center on Financial Risk in Environmental Systems at the University of North Carolina. Greg, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, very interested in this conversation. And so I want to just start out with you kind of explaining, when you talk about financial risk in environmental systems, what does that mean?
Well, there's variability in lots of natural processes, variability in the amount of rainfall we receive each year, temperatures, wind speeds, things like that. And for a lot of organizations, that translates into financial variability or financial risk. So some deviation from the expectations that someone might have with respect to their costs and revenues. And that can cause a lot of disruption economically. So if we were talking about rainfall, of course, a lack of rainfall can be a big problem for farmers. If you're talking about too much rainfall, flooding, that's a problem for property owners. We think about temperature. Deviations in temperature can be a big problem for power utilities, for example. If you have a very cool summer or a very warm winter, people are using a lot less energy than was expected. And this translates into a reduction in revenues for those groups that they have to find ways to manage. Wind speed and variability in sunshine these days are a big deal for investors in renewable energy technologies. So the idea is that if we understand variability in these natural systems, we can trace it through to variability in financial outcomes and give people a better idea of what risks they face, and then try and come up with clever ideas for how to manage that risk.
Very interesting. So the risk could be to a municipality, it could be to an investor, it could be to a farmer. You have kind of all these great possibilities for who is at risk from the I guess wild swing in the environmental situation.
Yes, and of course, climate change is in the background with all of this because most of the indications are that we're seeing greater variability in these natural processes, and that we can expect even more variability in the future. I should say that a lot of what we'll describe today is being labeled as climate risk by the investor community, groups like that. I would make a small distinction. It certainly is concerns over climate change that have brought more attention to these challenges in recent years. But many of the risks we're talking about existed absent climate change. So climate change certainly has the potential to make many of them worse. But these are risks that existed regardless of the impacts with climate change that we see in the future.
Because you're talking about, it could be a drier year, it could be a wetter year, it could be a windier year. It doesn't necessarily have to be a climate change fueled deviation from the norm. It could just be, hey, it was a rainy year this year, right?
True.
Yeah,
Although climate change has the potential, of course, to make things more variable and thus to increase the risk.
And do things like hurricanes factor into this? Is that That's a
Yes,
huge risk, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's another big concern. As we think about how well we can characterize these risks, this variability in these natural systems, a lot of it comes down to data.
Hmm.
And so sometimes with very extreme events like hurricanes, we don't have as much data as we'd like. There's only been a few of these big events that happen. Whereas if we wanted to talk about variability in wind speed or temperature or rainfall, we have sometimes 100 years plus of records that we can begin to draw on as we think about how much variability we might expect.
Hmm. And so on the water side, you mentioned too much water, not enough water. We have hurricanes. Are there other water-related risks that should be mentioned?
Sure. We do a lot of work with hydropower producers, as you might expect when you have drought. There's a reduction in stream flow, and that's the fuel that drives the turbines. And so, if you have very low stream flow for an extended period of time, an hydroelectric power generator can expect significantly lower revenues, and that's something that can be a big challenge. Also, for not only the generator itself, there are some independent generators, but for large utilities or even regions of the country like the Pacific Northwest that rely on hydropower for a substantial portion of their overall electric power generation, these can provide some big challenges. We do some work on inland navigation, and there I'm talking about shipping in the Great Lakes or the Mississippi. When water levels are either too low or too high, this can disrupt barge traffic. And barges are one of the least expensive means by which we have of moving bulk cargoes like wheat, corn, gravel, iron ore, things like that. And so that can significantly increase the price of those commodities because the transport costs make up a substantial fraction of the overall price.
So at University of North Carolina, you guys are looking at these specific places around the country, looking kind of nationwide, putting out information and reports that municipalities or investors are using. What's kind of your work there?
Well, we work with a lot of different groups. There's a number of different industry sectors, as we talked about, inland navigation, barge companies, large firms like Cargill that move crops down the Mississippi to export markets. But increasingly, we're also seeing a lot of attention being paid to these sorts of issues by investors, by lenders, and the groups that service them as well, groups like credit ratings agencies. From an investor standpoint, in 2020, the CEO of BlackRock, which I believe is the largest asset manager in the world, came out and said that climate change represented the biggest single new threat that they were exploring as they began to look for new investment opportunities. The credit ratings agencies, those that assess the credit worthiness of these industries, have also begun to pay a lot of attention. Groups like S&P Standard & Poor's, Moody's, have begun to look at water utilities, power utilities, large groups that depend on irrigation water, whether agricultural or the irrigation districts that provide the irrigation water themselves, and have actually instituted hydrologic variability criteria into their credit ratings to try and give them a better understanding of how variable the revenues and costs for these organizations might be, and thus how difficult it might be for them to reliably make payments on their debts.
Hmm. And so you guys, they come to you sometimes and want help with analysis, or you're putting out a series of reports that they use, or you're interested in a particular project and reach out to that industry. I'm just kind of trying to understand a little bit about how that works.
There's a lot of the latter. Often, a lot of the work that we're doing is funded by federal agencies, the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, groups like that, NOAA. All of these groups are interested in trying to characterize these risks, and So what we do then often is we go to some of these industries and describe what we're trying to explore, how it might benefit them, and we've actually had a great deal of cooperation from these groups overall. And then some of them coming back to us later and asking us to work on specific issues for them. So it really is. It's been very gratifying to see the amount of interest that many of these groups have had in the types of work that we're doing, and working closely with them is great for us too, because we learn a lot more about the systems that we need to model. It puts us in a position to try and characterize the risks much more comprehensively, and then allows us to come up with some more creative solutions than we would have if we were just sitting in our offices at the university.
And I imagine that a lot of that cooperation from industry is coming from them seeing the risks, materialize to their businesses and the events of the past recent years and everything. They're really kind of realizing this is important.
I think that people in many of these industries have a lot of risks that they've got to worry about. But more recently, as lenders, as investors, as the credit ratings agencies have begun to ask them some hard questions, this has risen to the top of the list, or near to the top of the list. And so, they like anybody else, they are forced to prioritize the risks that people are most concerned with. And this is one of the areas that has gotten a great deal of attention, both from the groups we talked about as well as the mainstream media these days. So it's been a growing focus for many of these sectors.
How long has been the Center on Financial Risk been working there at UNC?
Well, my research group has been focused on these issues for the better part of a decade now. Okay. We formally named the center in 2016 when the university was kind enough to make a significant investment in allowing us to expand some of our activities. So, and that includes both the Gilling School of Global Public Health, as well as the UNC Institute for the Environment, both of which have been generous to the center over the last few years.
Yeah, there's so much intersection between these public health issues, environmental issues, financial issues. It makes sense for there to be a lot of collaboration. And then, so I guess you have a team, a staff and other faculty that work on these projects, and then probably opportunities for graduate students and others to get involved.
Yes, it's very interdisciplinary. Most of the people working in my research group come out of an engineering background, some with an environmental science background, but they spend a lot of time in courses on statistics, courses on economics, finance, financial risk management. So that it really is a very interdisciplinary crew. And really, it's a wonderful group to work with because we are working on similar topics within different areas. Again, whether we think about water utilities or power utilities or agriculture, inland shipping, a lot of the base principles are the same, even if the applications are a little bit different. And what it allows for is a great deal of creativity on the part of the research team as we begin to think about solutions for helping folks manage and cope with these risks.
Well, let's talk about maybe some tools and some solutions or case studies or places. What are some of the tools that can help with risk management?
Well, so there are a couple of different categories, and some are tools that have been used for decades or even centuries. You know, if we talk about infrastructure. If you're talking about modulating or managing the extremes of the water cycle, dams and reservoirs have been around a long time. They store up water for us for use during dry periods, which is great. And they also serve to hold back floodwaters during periods of increased rainfall. And so that is one solution. And again, if we were talking about flooding, we could also talk about levees or something like that. But these are typically expensive ways to manage some of the most extreme risks. And you would you need to separate out public health or public safety related risks, if we're talking about dangers of a community to a community in terms of lives being put in jeopardy, that's one thing. But if we're talking about financial risk, it's often a very expensive way to manage the most extreme sorts of events, and it's also a very permanent investment, and which takes on greater relevance when we begin to think about the uncertainties associated with climate change. We don't know what climate change will bring for a lot of different natural processes, or how they'll vary, and so as a result, we may commit to an investment in something like a levee or a reservoir that will be around for 50 or 100 years, and yet the design criteria that we may use, thinking about the hydrologic variability that we see now versus what we might see 20, 30, 50 years down the road, might be very different. And so there's a concern in relying entirely on infrastructure, which is probably the primary tool that we've used in the past. So there are more adaptable measures. We usually put these in two categories. One is risk retention, and that means the organization or the group will mostly take the risk and keep it internal and manage it through things like cash reserves. So you sit on a rainy day fund, right, of some sort. Another option would be the ability to raise price. When revenues decline, because of, or in danger of declining because you have less water to pump or you have less electricity to sell, you raise the price. There's some ability to do that as well. And then the other category is risk shifting or risk transfer. And that's where you pay someone else effectively to take that risk off of your hands. So there, the most obvious example would be something like insurance or reinsurance. But there's an increasing number of novel instruments that are being offered now in the marketplace or developed to try and facilitate this sort of risk transfer. And here I'm talking about things like derivatives. There are, for the power industry, things called heating degree day and cooling degree day contracts, in which if you see a significant deviation from expectations, here I'm talking about a very cool summer where people are using much less air conditioning than might be expected, a power company can engage in a contract that will get them a payout to try and compensate for these reduced revenues during these times. There's also a lot of interest in things like index insurance, where the payout is not linked to the damages itself, the damages themselves, but instead to some physical measure of, say, rainfall. If cumulative rainfall over the year falls below a certain point, then there's some sort of payout. Or maybe in the case of a ski resort, it might be snowfall or snowpack. A reduction in snowpack beyond 25 or 30% of what was expected would be a real detriment to the ski resort, resulting in reduced revenues, and there might be a way for them to then be compensated through this contractual form. And then there are things being developed now along the lines of insurance-linked securities, things like catastrophe bonds, that are not necessarily marketed by insurers. It's not the insurers themselves taking on these risks, but rather the capital markets. So these sorts of products are offered more broadly, and people have the ability to pay into these funds that sit there, and they earn a return on them. But if the worst happens, and whatever event it is that triggers these payouts, if that occurs, then some or all of that capital ends up going to the person that suffered the damages. So there's all sorts of creativity that's being exercised in this area these days, and so in some ways it's a very exciting place to be.
Yeah, very, very interesting. That whole range of solutions there. The reinsurance thing always caught my attention, because when there's a big disaster or a big incident, then these insurance companies are paying out so much money. They have to kind of have insurance for themselves, right? When something like Superstorm Sandy comes along and does that damage in New York or whatever it might be.
And the size of these events is growing, both as a result of variability in the climate, but also as a result of society building more and more, putting more value at risk, more valuable assets in the way of some of these storms, of some of these natural events. And so at one point, maybe the reinsurance industry was capable of insuring the insurers to the degree that was necessary. But now there's some question as to whether they have the capacity to do that. And so these things, these newer tools that are coming available, things like catastrophe bonds, are trying to take advantage of capital that is out there beyond these insurers and bring that into the risk management sphere. So hopefully offering opportunities for greater efficiency, lower costs for managing these risks.
And I guess that some entities will take a diversify approach where you mentioned all those different ways that you can kind of address risk. And so I imagine they're picking and pulling sometimes and piecing things together and spreading it out a little bit. Is that true? Or
so every organization tries to find some sort of layered approach, right? There are things that make sense for more moderate types of events, damaging events, and things that make sense for more extreme types of events. And so the idea is to build some sort of integrated approach wherein maybe you have infrastructure taking care of the lower level risks, and then you have some cash reserves for taking care of the events that might be a little bit more severe. And then for those really extreme events for which it would be very difficult to hold as much cash on hand all the time, then maybe you pass that risk along to someone else.
Okay. Well, I want to ask a little bit more about some of the specific work you do. And on my end, I'm actually going to pull up a map that you all have. It's from the homepage of your website. So it shows the United States. And you've got a bunch of different places where you're kind of doing work. You've got icons for water, financial risk, energy, food, shipping, hurricane. This is really cool to someone like me who likes maps and environmental policy and everything. Wanted to hear a little bit about some of these spots and just from a high level, kind of the water risks and potential solutions for some of these areas. Maybe talk about the Great Lakes a little bit.
Sure. The Great Lakes and the Mississippi experience similar sorts of risks when water levels, particularly when water levels decline below a certain point. The ships, the barges that move through these systems are optimized to make their way through the shallow locks and harbors with a maximum load, carrying a maximum load, and that causes them to sit low in the water, right? There's a large draft between the water level and the bottom of the ship. When those water levels decline below a critical threshold, then the ships can no longer carry a full cargo load. And so they have to do what's called light loading, which results in a reduction in the amount of money that they earn on the shipping, but it also results in a reduction in the amount of cargo that can be moved through those shallow areas. And so that's not only financially disruptive to the barge firms themselves, but it's also financially damaging to those groups that are looking to move the commodities to market. And so if you understand something about variability of water levels in those systems, you can come up with good estimates of how much money they might lose and how often, right? That's some measure of financial risk. And so we've tried to come up with some new financial instruments, in this case index insurance, that links to the water level. And as water level declines below a certain specified threshold, then some of these firms will earn a payout from the insurer. And so it's not only a problem in the Great Lakes of the Mississippi, but also in any sort of navigable waterway that has a lot of commercial traffic. The Rhine and the Danube in Europe have been subject to some significant losses as a result of, or at least commercial users there have been subject to significant losses in recent years as a result of drought.
Okay, and so you mentioned the Mississippi. It's kind of the same water risk there as the Great Lakes.
Very similar, yeah.
Okay.
Similar,
okay.
different systems, but a similar mechanism.
Sure. One of the areas that caught my attention too is the Central Valley out in California. You've got a water icon out there. What's going on in the Central Valley?
So we've got a lot of interrelated challenges associated with drought in the Central Valley. One is that obviously when there's less water, then there's less hydropower. And so less hydropower typically means that the power companies have to rely more on thermal generation, natural gas, coal, etc. Usually natural gas in California, which is more expensive than hydropower. So as they rely more on that, the price of electricity can go up. Now, at the same time, when farmers experience drought and have less surface water available for irrigation, they pump more groundwater. So they're bringing that water up from several hundred feet down, which takes a lot of electricity. And so they're subject to some financial risk because at exactly the time they're using the most electricity, the price tends to be higher. And so that puts them in a difficult position. So understanding how these systems are linked is a big part of what we do. And so even when the risks are not terribly obvious, just based on one measure, if we can put together a more integrated understanding of the system, we can give people a better feel for their financial risk.
Yeah. Looking back at the map again, there's a lot of water pieces around here, but you have one that's just kind of national. It says U.S. Water Utilities and has got a water drop there. What's going on?
So water utilities face an interesting challenge these days. It's become more and more difficult to expand supplies. We're not building many new reservoirs anymore, both because we've used up the best available sites, and thus those that remain are more expensive, and also because we've become more aware of the environmental impacts associated with these big water projects. So as the pace of expansion for these new water sources has slowed, the question is, how do we begin to manage drought? Because in the past, we've managed it mostly by maintaining a lot of capacity that's rarely used, but is available to us when these dry periods come. And so increasingly what you see is water utilities turning to what we would call adaptive measures. So they put in place the conservation measures we're all familiar with, right? We can't water our lawns or wash our cars outside. Although those have become increasingly stringent in recent years. And then in a lot of areas, we end up buying water from someone else that can spare it. If we're in the East, sometimes there's another water utility nearby that we can buy water from. If we're in the West, it's often cities buying water from agriculture. Now, what this does relative to the past is it throws the financial planning of the utility into a different light, whereas before they would have one big reservoir that they would need to make payments on at a constant level because they had taken out debt every year. They knew what they needed to meet. Now they're in a situation where what happens if they put in place very stringent conservation measures? Well, it reduces their revenues. And what happens if they're buying water from agricultural or nearby urban areas? That increases their costs. And so they've got to manage this level of financial variability that they never had to deal with in the past. And so one of the things pushing them to manage it is the credit ratings agencies that have begun to look at their financials in the last 10, 15 years and saying, wow, there's a lot more variability here than there used to be. And that's a problem for or the threat of a change in their credit rating is a big problem for water utilities because the vast majority of their costs are associated with debt service. They've borrowed money through the municipal bond market to pay for all the pumps and the pipes and the equipment. And so even a small change in their credit rating results in a change in the interest rates that they pay on that debt. And if you wanted an example, you could think about it as a homeowner. Even a small change in the interest rate that we would pay on our mortgage, 1%, 2%, results in a big change in our monthly outlay. And so water utilities experience that often to a much higher degree because you're talking about organizations where often 50+% of their annual costs are associated with debt service. So they've got some big challenges that they need to deal with over time. And are trying to come up with new ways to do it. And so we've looked at how they might pool their risks, because not everyone experiences drought at the same time. So the idea would be that rather than each of us sit on a $100 reserve to pay out when the drought comes, maybe each of us could put in $20 or $30 into a common pool, knowing that not all of us are going to be calling on it at the same time. Now, how big that pool has to be, $20 or $30 per, or $40 or $50 per utility, requires a lot of understanding of the natural system. And so we spend a lot of time trying to come up with assessments of how correlated conditions are across broad spatial areas, and that way we can make better assessments of how large that fund would need to be.
Very, very, very interesting. Well, I definitely encourage people to go to your website and take a look and look at these different areas and the information that links to them all. It's interesting to me for sure. Lastly, I kind of want to ask, maybe looking in your crystal ball a little bit into the future here, into this field of work. How you see it continuing to change, and what role, the changing climate and the unpredictability figures into all that as well. Just, it seems like this field's been changing rapidly recently with all these different tools and options. So yeah, just kind of wondering as your thoughts on going forward, what this could look like.
It strikes me that it will be the investors, it will be the lenders, and the groups that support them, like the credit ratings agencies, that will really begin to drive change in this area. As more and more organizations are asked by these groups to explain the risks that they are subject to, and to describe the risk management strategies that they're using to try and mitigate some of these risks, I think you'll continue to see a lot of innovation. I think one of the interesting areas in which we're seeing some change, and this is an area in which we spend a lot of time from a research standpoint, is it used to be that you would focus on only perhaps the natural system. So how much rain does it take to create a flood of a certain size? Or how much does wind speed have to change before I can't produce enough wind power to pay off on my investment, something like that. But increasingly what we're seeing is that to do a proper assessment of the financial risk, it requires an understanding of multiple components. So we talked about hydropower earlier. So or even we talked about water utility. So a water utility is subject to natural variability in stream flow, which says how much water is coming down the stream. So you've got the natural system there. But invariably, these systems are managed to some degree by, say, a dam or a reservoir. So you have to not only understand how rainfall translates into stream flow, but how much storage you have in that reservoir to protect you from drought as well. So the infrastructure is important. And then you may move on to the next situation and have to understand the economic system. So it's not only the natural and the natural system, the infrastructure that are contributing to saying how often you'll be short of water, but it's the price for water that you can charge that may also have a big impact. So what we're seeing now is that really to understand many of these risks, you have to have an understanding of all three components: the natural processes, the infrastructure, and the economic systems, in order to characterize the risk, and then in order to come up with new financial instruments, new risk management strategies that can cost effectively mitigate that risk.
Yeah. Complex and interdependent. Very interesting. Well, Greg, I appreciate the time and all this perspective and information. I learned a ton, and I feel like there's a chance to drill down into some of these geographic areas and have conversations there. So maybe that'll happen in the future. But thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. Enjoyed talking with you.
Waterloop, waterloop, waterloop.
The Waterloop podcast is brought to you by High Sierra Showerheads, the smart and stylish way to save water, energy, and money while enjoying a powerful shower. Use promo code WATERLOOP for 20% off at highsierrashowerheads.com.
You're in the water loop.